Hello, welcome all. I'm Abhishek, also known as ABC, and topic is discussion on different managed services like Databricks, Cloudera, Snowflake, Talent, Informatica. There are many, and in different zone, and which it's not like all of them solves the same problem, but we will talk about different managed services. Databricks. With Databricks, the one very important thing it comes is manage Spark. For me, I still believe Spark is a bit complicated service, and fine tuning is hard. So, as Databricks, that thing is done pretty cool. Like most of the jobs are very well already managed in there based on configuration in Databricks, which is efficient enough. Another beautiful thing about Databricks is the notebook ecosystem. So now they are building everything on the notebooks. Like you can run the notebook as a job, you can even orchestrate, you can schedule it, you can drive, and in the same notebook you can work with different interpreter like Scala, Python, or R. So that is another part which makes it easy. Adding external libraries, that is as well easy based on the cluster model. And now they are adding more components, like they're adding data lake, then delta lake, sorry, and then Databricks SQL. Then they bought Redash or some visualization which is it integrated, and I'm pretty sure they're coming up with schema registry as well. It means this uh, the space of lineage and metadata information. So this is what they are bringing everything, and the new concept of lake house, they are driving that in that particular sense that you can drive machine learning and database everything on the same notebook zone. So you log in one single system and you get all this particular point if you are very much into the Spark ecosystem. I will take a pause here to understand what others view on this.
We migrated from Cloudera to AWS. Our on-prem cluster was on Cloudera, and on AWS we're using EMR for data transformations and SageMaker for our ML training to train our models. Yeah.
Why you move away from Cloudera? That will be the first. And when you are saying with AWS and SageMaker, I think many will be interested in understand like what is that ecosystem is all about, how SageMaker is different or well or good if you compare with Cloudera or any other services.
So we had a lot of NLP use cases, and our on-prem cluster was not so scalable. We needed GPUs to train our models, and we were facing scalability issues. So that's why we tried to use SageMaker, which is basically you can train your models in script mode. You can specify what instances you need, how many instances you need, and the moment you train your model, you can basically shut down your training job, for example. So this was one of the major problems we were facing. Yeah. And we also evaluated Glue, but in Glue, it was not possible to install our custom Python packages, which we want, for example, Tesseract to extract text from an NLP document. Yeah, so that's why we decided to use EMR.
Do you think SageMaker is doing an amazing work when it comes to complete end-to-end data engineering and ML pipeline?
For data engineering, we are using EMR. Only to train the model, we are using training jobs. Once a model is created, we don't use SageMaker after that point.
Any particular reason why you didn't choose
Uh,
end-to-end?
we are still evaluating it. So it's because when we were on-prem, when we deployed a model to production, we had a custom solution using Kubernetes. So that part we are still evaluating if we can use SageMaker. Personally, I find it very nice because you can create your model endpoint, you can specify everything. If you want to do alpha, beta testing, monitoring, everything is out of the box, but it's a bit expensive also.
We are trying to use Watson Studio for machine learning. It's called Cloud Pack for Data. It's like IBM's product. So Watson Studio is another Jupyter notebook, but it has integrated with Hadoop. So it connects to Hadoop via REST through Livy service. Mm, yeah, so pretty much you can access all Hadoop tables, I mean Hive tables, using your Python or Scala. Yeah, I think these three are the main languages where you can use train the model, uh, even schedule the job as well. So and you can there are some options to monitor also. So I mean, initially it was Watson Studio 1.2.3. Now it is they completely transformed their product to Cloudpak for data. So they call it as CP4D. So yeah, we are trying to the plan is to use that tool for long for all the machine learning use cases. Basically, I mean, it serves like as a platform for both training the model and executing the model. I mean, the scheduling as well. I think it's. I mean, I had option to try that. It was cool. I mean, I was able to connect to Hadoop through some through some parameters and was able to access the Hive tables and do some uh, practice some online training. I mean, model training and things like that. Yeah, and it has all the. I mean, once it is open for, I think it's like a Jupyter notebook, so you can access all the scikit-learn or whatever the machine learning classifiers basically. So it's a good tool. I mean, not so many people are using it as far as I heard, but yeah, it's a good option. The only thing is it's with OpenShift platform, so that's another big blow. Oh yeah, because yeah, I mean people are wanted to use Red Hat, but they this tool comes with OpenShift platform, so we need to have the relevant. Of course, there's still that's fine. I mean, the behind the systems things are working in the same way. That's one of the criteria because in my organization they wanted to downgrade the OpenShift and but the tool offers. I mean, comes up with only OpenShift platform, so that's another reason to continue this tool basically. But on the parallel lines, they also wanted to try Sagemaker because I mean AWS is the preferred vendor, so there will be some discussions to continue on, which has to be continued for even more further long. I mean, like between Sagemaker or Watson Studio, but Watson Studio is it's like the preferred choice for now.
Cloud is AWS or IBM Cloud?
So it is cloud is still AWS. That's I mean another cool thing is yeah, thanks for reminding it. It can connect to all the clouds basically. So it can connect to all the big three clouds and also of course IBM Cloud is another. Of course they have a lot of offerings to that IBM Cloud, but for us it is we are more specific to on-premise and AWS.
I will. Then this question is to open to all. So when we are coming to the managed services, like now Chanik just said about Watson Studio. Then before that we talk about SageMaker. I'm feeling that for machine learning we are always going with this managed services. But what about the data processing layer? Like how that is happening, or how you are getting the data from databases, doing ETLs. Are you using any managed services for that, or just using any particular uh, pipeline based on raw EMR or EC2, or just create your own cluster and just deploy it? So are you using anything for data processing, any managed services, or no?
Okay, maybe I can give a start. I mean, with respect to Watson Studio, so like I said, we connect majorly 90% of the workloads gets connected to Hadoop, the Cloudera. So, so that's what I mean. The Libby is another key service here. So it connects to Hive tables over REST. So I mean, there are some problems with it, but as such, from the data processing point of view, so the data will be. I mean, we are still using Spark. Uh, I mean, Hadoop Cloudera provided Spark version. So with that, data transformation happens, and then it connects to. I mean, once the tables or transformations are done, then we connect to for training the model basically. So that is one thing, and another apart from that we have EMR, but then we have not yet started with integrating AWS with Watson Studio. So that is another problem maybe we need to see. And lastly, third thing is we are also trying to connect to Snowflake. Yeah, uh, so so the tool itself is not only being used for machine learning but also for transformation purpose, because it gives business users access to the programming language of their choice, so they can write their transformations on their own and then connect to Snowflake and store the data there. So that is an option being tried out.
your your machine learning model is reading data from where? From directly from the blob
Hadoop.
storage, from the database, or from Snowflake or data
Hadoop.
warehouse? First that, and second, how are you? So all these tools and technology, Watson Studio or Sagemaker or anything, uh, they are useful if it you could do reproducibility. Any
Yeah.
managed services where you can reproduce the same thing, you can experiment on the same thing, you have a history, you have a lineage, so that's why you are paying them more, or else you can even
Mm,
take the open source and deploy
mm,
it. How all the like what is your experience in using these tools?
yeah. So the problem is the models initially the models were built like 4 or 5 years ago in SAS. So that's the main thing. I mean, those were written in SAS platform. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, if it is, I think it's in MATLAB or something. Uh, uh, Now, what we are trying to do is even migrating those SAS-based models to Python-based models, and uh, yeah, the data connectivity or the data itself is available in Hadoop, in Hive tables. I mean, there is some analytical tables those were created. They are called like feature engineering tables, which has 1,000 or 1,200 columns basically against one particular dimension. I mean, customer or something like that. So these tables gets connected to the model, and then on top of that, the training happens. So majorly, or I can say most of the situations for all the models that we have, they will be uh, they are still in Hadoop, in Hive. The connection happens over the rest. That's what I can say basically. So, I mean, we are not. I mean, the connectivity to Snowflake is something. Is It's not in relation with what we are talking about right now because it's machine learning. But the Snowflake thing is a little bit a parallel thing that users wanted to try transformations basically.
And okay, so others has any different opinion? That are you using managed services in any different ways?
No, not managed services as such. I mean, even we are working completely on open source. So, like long back, we used to, work on AWS Athena. But eventually, when we saw that it is built on top of Presto, then we spinned up our own Presto cluster and starting, writing our queries there. And we also integrated it with Apache Superset. So basically, rather than relying on any cloud or any managed services, we spend up our own cluster and we were saving more than 50% of the cost. If you ask me, like in our case, our motto is to rely on self-managed clusters rather than relying on more of managed services. So that's the motto. Yeah.
When it comes to the managed services versus self-managed and cost saving, there is a cost of human hour as well.
Yes.
First, I'm a very big open source advocate, so you can already say that I don't like managed services or I'm not preferred on that side. But sometimes I saw timing, people, and expertise. So nowadays, when we talk about technology, we don't use one technology. Like as you said, you're already using Presto, Superset, maybe not maybe, I'm pretty sure to access it means you need OAuth, IDC, HTTPS, SLS in between, and then in Presto scaling, auto scaling, yeah, it works, but you still need somebody to understand, manage the spikes, and monitoring, observability. All these are cost and time, and it doesn't mean managed services are doing it very good. No, that is a false assumption. But how are you doing it, and what are the trade-offs you saw? Because you said you used to use AWS managed services Athena, and then you move to build on your own. What are the trade-offs? What is the pros and cons in your point of view?
I would say cost and optimum utilization is what I would say, because when you are using managed services, you are not in control of the resources that is allocated to you. It can be too high, too low, etc., and you have no control over that part. But when you have you are spinning up your own things, so you can actually manage based on the data, because you can predict that, okay, today if suppose my daily active users are so and so, then if I'm increasing by a ratio of 5%, 1% or 2% or 5% on a monthly basis, then how much can I predict that my data will increase by such percentage? So that is the ratio in which I have to increase my resources eventually. So these things that internally team will know is what I'm trying to say. So you can actually optimize your resources. Like if I don't need 100 workers in my Trino cluster, I mean Presto cluster, then I can easily scale it down. It's like having freedom to do our own things, and getting dependent on others. So that is something I would say I would prefer. Again it's debatable, but yeah. And what you said is absolutely right, that okay, when you're managing your own cluster, then human hours are definitely accounted for, because now it's not that I'm just writing ETL jobs or doing transformations, but I also have to manage the cluster itself, which is again a headache, because my hive pod can go down anytime. My superset can go down. The users can complain, okay, that we are not able to access superset. And the Trino workers, if my auto scaling is enabled, then my auto scaling happened after the query was submitted, which is another issue, which I think you already raised an issue there in the Trino cluster, I believe, regarding checkpointing. So yeah, I mean, too many things are there, but eventually in the long run, what I see is that things become stable.
But it is open to all. It is not only me and Vaibhav is talking, so feel free to jump in. I have a Anmol, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
please go ahead. Yeah.
definitely wanted to comment. So I've used, open source before, open source via some managed companies as well, but like mostly Spark or like data lake ecosystem S3 as such. And I think about a year or something I spent using Delta Lake for some of my experiences. And what I realized, right, like there were limitations when I was using this open source version, because in Delta Lake itself, I think the Z ordering and stuff is not supported by just the open source. Then it becomes a limitation after a point, where without a managed service, you cannot optimally use the raw storage as such. And Delta Lake, in terms of S3, the way it's evolved and the file formats, things like Delta Lake Hoodie, these bring a lot of benefits, I feel. And that's why I was, up for using it. But after a point, without that feature, it becomes like, how do you optimize it, right? So I feel sometimes there is usefulness in the managed service, like what Databricks provides, but something like you mentioned in terms of man hours and stuff, is that's what I've been contemplating as well. Like when you use storage system like S3 and stuff, there have been issues like you have to make sure that you're optimally storing it in certain file sizes, right? Because otherwise the overhead is too much, and it's in terms of number of people, then you have to essentially increase the number of people to be able to manage that, because it's not only one service that you're handling. It's not just a storage service, because you want to expand it, like you want to add more data monitoring system, you want to add more ETL system. So ultimately it's like, how do you, like, my question is ultimately, if someone has been able to determine, right, other than the cost of storage, like yes, the basic storage, it's going to bring you lots of cost efficiency, but how do you determine, in terms of the efforts, like how do you optimally do that in terms of the efforts you're spending to scale that up, bring more features in, how do you define the cost of people to the cost of, when if there would have been a managed service, like what would have there been a difference? That is like a big question I've faced during my experiences.
Great point. And I think more or less who have this trade-off have the similar question. But then there is two things to note, Anmol. As you said, when it comes to Delta Lake, I know there are some very intelligent algorithms which are only available with the paid service, but not in the free open source version. But that brings to another point, the evolution of different technologies like Iceberg and Hoodie, where this kind of discrimination is not there, because these are very critical discrimination, where you are just left with all the relevant important feature, which by the way doesn't happen with Spark. So Databricks on the Spark provide a high level of optimizations and smartness, but the core functionality when it comes to Spark as a community, it is very hard to just detach some very important feature just by saying we are paid off. Uh, I think that's where I would say if something like this happen, it means I'm going to the era of vendor locking. It means I'm trapped. So, for example, now I go to the Delta Lake with Databricks. Now my entire pipeline I will have to build with that, and I can never get out of it. That is an expensive deal from my point of view. I won't say that is the best thing, but what is your opinion on that? Like, don't you think when using managed services where you can never get out is it's a bit it's a bit hard to just gulp?
I completely agree on that. Vendor lock-in is a very big issue. Going for a vendor and then you realize, okay, that's not the ideal one, in future maybe, and it's costing way more. That can be an issue. But something like, like you mentioned, right? Iceberg does not have certain limitations like Delta Lake has. But one thing I've faced is like, I think, well, from my experience, what I remember is firstly, like, Delta Lake and Hoodie were some of the biggest names that I used to hear. So I used to compare them, and then it was like there's a lot of pros and cons between Hoodie and Delta Lake, at least initially, and then you have to decide what to go towards, right? And then you decide to go towards one technology. Now you build your entire warehouse. The data lake, warehouse, whatever you call it, with one technology like Delta Lake, right? You change, like you use Parquet, but essentially it's abstracted by Delta Lake, so it has those logs and stuff. Pipelines are using that. Your end users are using it. Now you realize, okay, there are limitations, and there's Iceberg, which does not have these limitations, right? Now this and I think is like I have realized at a later stage maybe I could have done a better thing, when I was trying to compare it. But I feel like the way technologies evolve in parallel is very different, right? So how do you There's this cost of migration as well, right? If you were to use a better technology now. Today I realize, okay, in the open source version, there's limitation in Delta Lake and not Iceberg. Then there's migration time, basically planning processes. How do you do it in parallel? Like you have users which are using the data set. It might have terabytes of data or something, right? How do you migrate it, right? Then if you stick to open source, right? That is where I feel like sometimes vendor, like now depending on the vendor as well, right? If it's some new vendor or something which is not very reputable or something, there can be issues like they are not able to help you to large extent. But if there is a decent vendor, I feel sometimes those vendors can help you with a lot of problems, right? Like, okay, this is the issue that I'm facing with. They can recommend something or something to go about, right? Like rather than you spending time on open source where you're like, okay, this open source has limitation versus that open source has better features, and I might need to migrate for the longer future. And then you plan, and like in terms of planning, I assume it's minimum at least half a year to 1 year that you have to go through the planning to the execution process to actually execute it parallelly without users being affected, right? So that is sometimes I feel like, yes, vendor lock-in can be a question, but if they're optimally able to provide and improve services within itself, right? And they are particularly focused on it, because essentially, I mean, something to think about, right? Delta Lake is open source, Iceberg is open source. If Iceberg is able to implement it, even Delta Lake should have been able to implement it in open source. But seems like the paid version is much more being, developed constantly. So if the vendor is very, diligent about their product and they are bringing more and more features, sometimes that can be helpful, right, in terms of future perspective.
Great point. Others, any other comment on this point, like managed services and uh, lock-in, and then using another managed services which can outperform things, where you see no, there is a value of this managed services?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, my experience point of view, migration is a hell lot of headache. It takes many months we need to redesign. I mean, we are at the stage of migration last year from one of Cloudera version to a higher version. Even then, it is a bit of a headache because a lot of things have changed, and we need to change everywhere because we are not having a lot of commonalities like patterns. So we can, if we can change it one place, the rest of the places are already taken care of, like centralized libraries and things like that. So more or less, it's like on-demand pipelines without having much of integration with common tools or libraries, basically. So, I mean, from my point of view, my experience, migration is a hell. So we need to choose wisely what exactly needs to be done. Probably a POC has to be done with some of the example project, and then decide on if it can be scaled up to a bigger or wider data lake. I mean, data marts or something like that. So probably that should be done instead of completely coming up to the entire data lake. Change this one. So it's a headache to all the developers and QA people. Basically, like that's what I. And a lot of people, out of frustration, they left the company because of this migration. In fact, because it has taken like almost a year. So it's a valuable time, right? I mean, from the because there are a lot of changes going on, and we still don't want to just migrate, do the migration, and yeah. Yeah,
Just
I think
wanted to
I
add a point here. Yeah, yeah. Just wanted to add a point here that uh, we when we had to migrate, like Google invested in our company, and we had to migrate our stuff from Azure to GCP. So since we were using everything open source, it was a lift and shift for us, and it did not even take us more than 2 months to migrate the entire thing, because we all had our scripts ready, we all had everything ready. It's just that we have to change the libraries which were relevant to Azure to the libraries which are more relevant to GCP, and it was very easy. Rather than we were using one thing which was licensed, that is Tableau, and that was actually a headache for us to migrate, though it's a managed service. Because like if you reach out to the support, then they'll somehow try to sell you that okay, you buy consulting hours from us and this and that. And when we tried to do it on our own, it took us some time, but then it was a bigger headache than migrating things which we're managing on our own. So yeah, I mean, this is something I personally felt.
There is one thing, when we say managed services, we will stick to it. But do we really stick to that for that long nowadays? For example, Cloudera, Hortonworks, MapR used to be the king 4 or 5 years back. Now people are fastly moving out of it and moving to the Snowflake, Databricks. We are not sure for how long we will stick to that, because then in between suddenly somebody will come and say, okay, go with Kubernetes. Everything is containerized. It just run the containers behind the scene. It can be any cloud. You are vendor free, but it doesn't mean there is no services there. You may be using Istio and some paid version of Linkerd or something. Finally, you are again going to the managed service, but again you will leave it because there is some other technology will definitely come, outbid it, and the pain is again going to be similar or less. Like when we say open source may need movement of a lot, is it really a fact that a managed service doesn't need that kind of migration? What others think about it?
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Thing is that I mean, we should not have a centralized infrastructure for all the data lake problems. I mean that's where data mesh comes into the picture, like to manage their own uh, uh, domain or ecosystem. For example, products or cards. I mean, from the banking point of view, if you see, so they should have full control on what they can do, what their developers are interested in, and what are the benefits that they want. If they have a lot of merging things needs to be done, then probably they should choose something else. Like it's not like centralized for across the organization. So in my understanding, I mean, that kind of architecture should be put in place so that the centralized data teams will have only less impact or power to govern the rest of the small teams or elements. I mean, where they can probably do their things on their own. So if that is the case, then the interoperability comes into the picture. So you can just play around and try out different things. So it need not come from the top to from the top management. Yeah, we need to do this something like this. So I mean, yeah, I highly go with that plan of changing things because we have a lot of options coming in right now. We should definitely try out and get.
I agree on the fact that the market is very crazy. Like the number of tools that have evolved in the last 4 years or something, been like very yeah. Like I mean, one of the biggest migration I had was actually moving Redshift from Redshift to Data Lake system because of the fact that Redshift initially it was all storage and compute was coupled, and that's why like the cost was a big factor because it's fundamentally wrong, right? Like you buy certain resources, you're not using the compute, but you need storage resources. So that's where Data Lake was a huge help because you knew storage is going to be constant and compute is like whenever you serve it up, right? Now with all this Databricks and Snowflake coming up, they've solved that problem. Even Redshift has introduced. I recently heard. I don't follow them much, but I think certain compute nodes or something. What they've done is basically decoupled it, right? So it's crazy how market has evolved. And yes, I agree. Like with vendors migrating can be a pain. So I try to understand like what like when I look at something like Databricks, right, I feel like some like at least a Spark integration, right? They have. I feel they'll always be on top notch of it, right? Like Spark has been the go-to tool for ETL. And Databricks founders had basically founded Spark, right? So in terms of Databricks integration with Spark, managed Spark services, I feel it's going to be long-term thing because they contribute to it and stuff, right? So if you were to use it, like uh, unless something a big competitor comes to Spark itself, it's a very big this thing. But like Spark has been the go-to thing for quite some time. Even the fundamental architecture of Spark is basically why people prefer it, right? It's very difficult to change fundamental things. So I feel now I've started looking at in such a way when the companies are trying to create something, right? What is the fundamental problem they are solving? How they are solving it essentially. If it seems reasonable, and it has been like the reputation of the company has been a decent this thing, uh, it might make sense to bet over it for longer term, right? But it's always good to plan what were you to do if the company goes down, or what would you do essentially? Keep a backup plan. How would you do it? That's how I see it essentially. But like with open source, it's like yes, migration is a problem. My usual question comes right after a point. Like when I read about Uber engineering teams, when I follow them and stuff, or other big teams, right? The scale that they have to grow at engineers is like huge because they need a lot more engineers to start managing these open source services, and like to create. And from what I've heard, what I understand is they create their own version, right? They fork it off, they create their own version for different reasons, and then they need more engineers to maintain it, and then create much better interfaces internally and stuff, which can also be time taking, and then like can be very difficult to maintain, right? Like engineers are costly, plus it's very difficult to find right engineers to solve the problem, right? Especially with the growing need, right? It's very difficult to find the right engineer. So how do you do that? And that's why I sometimes feel like I'm kind of in the middle. I'm not biased anyway, but it's like looking at that problem, maybe sometimes having a vendor might make sense because then it's abstracted out to you, right? Because then you need limited number of engineers on your side to be able to understand the architecture of this thing and be able to interface it in your company. Whereas in terms of scaling, that vendor has to take care of it. They have to scale their engineers to provide services, to increase the features, to make sure everything is being dealt with, right? So that's how I see like some trade-offs between open source and managed services, like putting some thoughts into it.
Any other point in the same line? Because
Yeah,
managed
one thing I
yeah,
can
yeah, Chan.
just so a lot of managers, I mean, what they say is that I don't bother about infrastructure. I bother only about the business problems. So I mean, at the end of the day, they say the core logic, the business logic will stay with us. So the infrastructure is with need not be. I mean, I'm not much worried about the infrastructure. So I need my table to get created. So at some point of time, that's how people think from their point of view, right? I mean, I mean, it's something that we can also think from the IT point of view, from engineering point of view, that our solution should be sort not like creating an overhead to them, like to decide a lot of things. So they're at least interested. I mean, that's another headache that we need to communicate effectively, like why we need this tool. I see that is a big issue also.
Any tool can serve this purpose. I started disbelieving that infrastructure cannot be anything. Like now we are in that paradigm shift of modern technologies, that if you say anything tomorrow, I can't just say that I'm completely working in containerized environment, for example Docker, and I will say no, I won't use Docker anymore, I will directly deploy to the code, I will just push my code and say run, because it is easy. I don't need not to learn Docker, and I will just do things fast. There is no container run between, everything is so good. So uh, it is a paradigm shift, you just can't do that. And infrastructure is nowadays is more critical, because it is not one technology anymore. So I don't see in a market one managed service which does everything. There's none of them are like that. Services are good sometimes when you have a small team, low cost, but open source is great if you have a very good team and your company has personal interest on vesting on that, because nowadays
I think
open,
that's the great point. I mean, if the company has interest, I mean, that's the thing. Yeah.
if you're vesting in open source, you can bring people direct from there. Like one of the most critical problem with any of the services, even we take it or not, the problem is if you hire an engineer, for example, who used always in Snowflake, and we say we are completely on Databricks, and we say they both are same, it is all similar, they all are data warehouse. Is it really true? I mean, if you go think deeply, they are actually same. No, they are not same. Fundamentally, lot of things are so different that the Snowflake person can come and say, this thing in database is doing shit. It is bad. I don't want to use it. Use Snowflake. It is better. And maybe he or she will keep on pushing it, saying, no, this is better. Database doesn't do this good. This is not good. So that is another problem with uh, managed services, which I personally feel is bit biased. You get so much used to a particular technology, account manager, people, and their support response time, that you may end up selling the same thing in the new company, and they just don't know what to do about it now. Is it a valid thing, or do you think no, it doesn't work like that?
Absolutely, Abhishek. I mean, I second you on this. In fact, when you're using open source, the one thing that I feel is it's very easy for experimentation. If suppose there is something new which has evolved in the market, right? As everyone said, that so many things are there. If you want to explore, go spin up an instance of it, try out, your things, do a POC right away, and get back. Now, this is not easy when you want to try out something in a managed services, because that will require a sequence of approvals. Then you have to set up time with their account manager, set up meetings, and so many things. So experimentation is easy, and yeah, as you rightly said, right, that yeah, the leadership on top of you should be, their focus should be in vesting into these things. The long term goal should be that we need to build a good platform towards the end. So if that is the focus, then I would anytime say open source is good. I mean, yeah, but
I agree too.
mm,
Yeah, I was saying I agree too. I mean, there can, like, with managed services, if a person has used long enough for managed service, he or she gets used to it, plus becomes biased towards it. So that is likely to happen. Agree. Yeah, and to what Webhub was talking about, like with open sources, I feel like there's more support as such, in terms of you want to explore, if you want to reach out to people, right? Like if you're facing some issues, if you want to learn something, there's way more support or blogs people are writing about, right? With managed services, they're very very niche group of users, and plus, since people do not have an idea about what's going on, even they can't share their experiences about it, right? So that is one thing about open source, is like the support that you can get, plus the reading material is something which is difficult to find with any managed service.
Any other point? Managed services are good if you are very determined on the technology and you want to invest heavily on that. Not in the open source way, but you want to align with the same ecosystem. For example, if you are in Snowflake, you want to say, I'm going to use Snowflake for this, and they're bringing schema registry, so we will tie along with that. So we will build everything on Snowflake, which is, by the way, pretty easy in cloud, because when it comes to the cloud, because you don't want to buy this servers and all, you say, yeah, I will invest everything on Google Cloud, I will invest everything on Azure, on AWS, something. But when it comes to managed services, they always need to bring up more and more, because after discussing here, I realize why they always come with new things. They come with new thing because they need to build the entire ecosystem. If they just sell one thing, maybe it's an expensive option, maybe it is like, no, what if this thing you build, after that I need one more thing, it means I need to buy another managed service. So that's another kind of investment where engineering is not expensive, but money is there, but they just need the product output. But where engineering, you want to have a control on what you want to use, how you want to use, and you want to bring save money from money by investing a lot human hours, then I would say open source ecosystem is great. But as we all realized, with open source ecosystem, it needs heavy engineering. So it is not a cheap thing. Like, it is absolutely not a cheap thing if you want to stick with open source. Only thing is, with open source, not with open source, with our current generation of technologies, um most of the product line are not surviving for 10 of years. It is mostly like 6 months, you deliver something, yeah, it worked, okay, fine, next, bring the next product line up, which is something else, which can be built on some other technology. Finally, it can be microservices or REST API or HTTP, just push it. But behind the scene, you keep on changing things because on the product. In that things, I would still argue that open source is much cheaper, because you're always changing technology. One of them is like, your team is bootstrapping machine learning, they are not sure what they're going to build, what is the product, what is the algorithm they will use, what is the platform they will use. Then why invest on a managed service? Do everything in open source, invest 1 2 years, and first you decide that this is the line you will work. Like, maybe it is a PyTorch or TensorFlow, maybe it is deployment on completely on open source ML flow deployment, or in Sagemaker, it doesn't matter. But first you need to decide what exactly you want, not being immature and just buy a managed service just because we think it is good. That will be my take on with this discussion.
Yeah, it completely makes sense. I mean, whatever you said as a conclusiveness of it. I mean, it's like, the goal of the company, I would say. If the company's goal is that, okay, uh, tech side or data side of it, it's just a small part of it, they should ideally rely on managed services, because they will never do heavy investment, or they don't want experimentation or things like that in just that domain. But if a company is tech savvy, and tech is the core of it, then definitely, they should rely more on the infra, or the data platform team, who can actually perform these experimentations. And as a result of this experimentation, even if they choose managed services, they will always have the right questions to ask, why and which managed service to use, etc. So that is something that will go into the core of it. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Abhishek, as what you said.
No, I mean, as a conclusion, I wanted to say, since we talked about tools like Hoodie or Iceberg, so we should discuss more in depth on that particular tool, which actually helps us a lot. I mean, to understand actually the differences between the Hoodie's offerings and Iceberg's offerings, things like that.
No, I was just agreeing to Janak here. Like, I think having a talk about it would be really helpful. And in general, in terms of conclusion, I agree to your point. It's more about understanding your use case. It's about understanding the open source benefits versus what managed servers can cause an issue and stuff. Like, one point I just wanted to add, right? Like, one thing when I'm reading about Snowflake and stuff, how I feel is, right. Even if it's a managed service, something I feel like they've done well is, like, they've added this concept of external tables, right? Which is basically the idea you do not have to store data in Snowflake. You can store it in S3 or something, or Azure Cloud or somewhere, and you can point external tables of it, right? So thereby, not using the costly storage and shielding yourself and abstracting data something out. So yeah, it comes to understanding the managed service, what benefits it provide, what kind of lock-in can have versus comparing, how do you look at in terms of infrastructure, what kind of team you want to build, do you want to invest on open source, will you be ready to grow your team in such a way, and then invest time on understanding it. Yeah, agree.
Sorry, Karan, here, last couple of things that I found like very interesting about Snowflake is how it has managed the metadata in the form of information schema, which can be, which is so structured that it can actually become an application of its own. And the way that they have decoupled storage and computation is, anyways, like the brilliant stuff about Snowflake, where you have cluster build up, cluster bring down, then you have clustering introduced and indexing in a way which is going beyond just the normal master slave architecture of trying to get that indexing in a form which is more practical from a clustering standpoint. But yeah, I mean, there are these four features which has just blown my mind in case of Snowflake. And of course the adoption has sort of gotten fast paced recently, but I think it's the concepts that should be taken, that can be taken as principles itself in design, the way that the architecture has been made. So you probably just implement that as a part of even your software development cycle. That would bring in a lot of good things out of Snowflake.
But thank you all for joining. This was a pleasure. And this call was really interesting because we started with managed services, but then we go deeply on the technical side, understanding how all of them work. And based on the feedback, I will try to schedule like in next week, in next few weeks, to compare this technology stack, where I will like to have some volunteer on arguing on, or I would say advocate of the technology, and then we will have a very good conclusion on why this is good, why that is not good.